November 18, 1942, Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The air shimmered with tropical heat as 16 Lockheed P-38 Lightnings of the 339th Fighter Squadron descended onto the corrugated steel runway. The roar of twin Allison engines rolled across the jungle canopy, sending vibrations through the humid air. From hidden observation posts on the perimeter, Japanese scouts watched in silence, binoculars glinting in the sunlight, their messages whispered over crackling radios back to Rabaul. What they saw filled them with contemptuous amusement. These were not the predators they expected. Not the sleek single-engine interceptors that danced in the clouds like their own Mitsubishi Zeros, but ungainly machines, twin engines, twin booms, awkward symmetry that seemed to defy the grace of aerial combat. To the Japanese eye, they looked wrong. Too heavy, too complicated, too American in their excess. At Rabaul, headquarters of the Japanese 11th Air Fleet, officers received these reports with quiet satisfaction. Once again, the Americans had proven their weakness. Reliance on machinery, not spirit. The Zero had been forged from the philosophy of perfection through subtraction, every ounce removed, every element refined until nothing remained but purity and maneuverability. The P-38 was the opposite. It embodied abundance, power through redundancy, victory through mechanics rather than mastery. To the Japanese command, it confirmed what they already believed, that Americans lacked the warrior heart, compensating instead with engines and metal. They laughed in the war rooms of Rabaul, confident that no cumbersome machine could ever match the divine agility of the Zero. But what none of them knew, what none of them could imagine, was that this strange, twin-tailed fighter would soon redefine the very meaning of aerial supremacy. In just 5 months, it would reach across hundreds of miles of open ocean, strike with surgical precision, and bring down the most revered figure in the Imperial Navy. The mockery that began in the jungles of Guadalcanal would end in silence over the skies of Bougainville. The laughter would die with the man who had once orchestrated Pearl Harbor. And in the smoke of wreckage, the myth of Japanese invincibility would collapse, not in a grand fleet battle, but in the cold precision of an American interception. The P-38 Lightning had arrived, and the era of the Zero was already ending. The disdain for the P-38 began months earlier, far from the humid jungles of Guadalcanal. August 1942. Japanese intelligence reports first noted strange twin-engine fighters appearing in the skies of the Aleutian Islands. They were identified as the new Lockheed Lightning, a curiosity more than a threat. On August 9th, 2 P-38Es from the 343rd Fighter Group intercepted and destroyed a pair of Japanese Kawanishi H-6K flying boats, the first Japanese aircraft to fall to the Lightning's guns. But to the officers of the Imperial Navy, this distant skirmish meant nothing. The Aleutians were frozen wastelands, irrelevant to the great struggle unfolding in the South Pacific. In Tokyo and Rabaul, analysts dismissed the American design as another product of industrial excess. A twin-engine fighter, they wrote, reflected America's obsession with machinery over skill. Reports circulated through fighter units claiming that such aircraft would be inferior to our Zeros in any combat-requiring maneuver. The belief was absolute and dangerous. Among those reading the assessments was Commander Minoru Genda, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. In official documents, his conclusion was simple. The Americans, unable to match Japanese craftsmanship, had resorted to complexity. Every added part was another point of failure. It was a philosophy forged in cultural pride. The Zero was a samurai blade, light, lethal, precise. The P-38 was a hammer built for blunt force and endurance, and so the Japanese laughed, mistaking difference for weakness. When the first Lightnings arrived at Guadalcanal in November 1942, their tactics baffled their opponents. They refused to enter the dance of turning dogfights where the Zero excelled. Instead, they struck from altitude, made single slashing passes, and vanished into the clouds at speeds the Japanese could not match. What the Japanese saw as cowardice was, in truth, evolution, the birth of energy warfare, where altitude and velocity replaced acrobatics and instinct. The first real encounter came on November 18, 1942, when P-38s escorting B-17 bombers clashed with Japanese fighters. 3 enemy aircraft fell, The numbers were small, the meaning immense. The lightning had drawn first blood in the Solomons, and the era of the turning fight was over. The Japanese still didn't know it, but a revolution had already begun. The sky no longer belonged to the most graceful. It belonged to the fastest, the highest, the most relentless. December 27, 1942. The sky over Dobodura, New Guinea burned white in the midday sun as 12 P-38s from the 39th Fighter Squadron climbed into formation. Below them stretched miles of jungle and coastline. Ahead, Japanese aircraft rising from their base to intercept. The encounter lasted minutes. The results would echo through every command center in the Japanese Navy. When it was over, the Lightnings had destroyed multiple enemy fighters while suffering minimal losses. They had done it without ever turning inside their opponents, without ever fighting the kind of battle the Zero was built to win. Instead, they dove from high altitude, unleashed concentrated bursts of gunfire, and climbed back into the heavens before the Japanese could react. The Zero pilots were left chasing ghosts. Their famed maneuverability meant nothing when their enemy refused to play by the old rules. In the wreckage that littered the New Guinea jungle, the myth of the Zero's invincibility began to crack. Captured war diaries from the Japanese 4th Air Group later revealed the unease spreading among their ranks. These twin-engine fighters appear at heights we cannot reach. They dive through our formations with frightening speed, fire, and climb away before we can respond. It was not just frustration, it was fear. For months, the Japanese command had believed the P-38's complexity made it fragile, its weight a fatal flaw. But the evidence was mounting that the American aircraft was something new, a weapon that fused power, precision, and endurance. A machine designed not for agility, but for dominance. By January 1943, Japanese intelligence revised its evaluation of the Lightning. The report was calm, almost clinical, yet fatally misguided. It concluded that the aircraft's weight and complexity made it vulnerable in close combat, advising pilots to force engagements where their own superiority was absolute. But there was no such superiority left. The latest P-38G models could climb higher, fly faster, and strike farther than any Japanese fighter in the Pacific. With drop tanks, they could reach targets 1,000 miles away, far beyond the Zero's range. In their noses, 450 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon focused their fire like a scalpel. The Americans were learning fast. Major John Mitchell, soon to lead the mission that would change the Pacific War forever, was already refining tactics built on one principle: never surrender the advantage. Never turn, never slow. The hunters were adapting, and soon they would hunt a man whose name defined Japanese naval power. Isoroku Yamamoto, March 3, 1943, the Bismarck Sea. The sun was just breaking through the low mist when the Japanese convoy appeared. 8 troop transports, 8 destroyers, carrying over 6,900 men to reinforce New Guinea. To the Imperial Command, this was a mission of confidence. Japan still believed the South Pacific could be stabilized, that their empire's edges could hold. But waiting above the sea, invisible against the light, was a storm the Japanese had never imagined. A coordinated strike force of American and Australian bombers, escorted by the silent guardians of the sky, P-38 Lightnings. The attack began just after 10 a.m. The air turned black with explosions as Allied aircraft swooped in waves, skip-bombing at mast height, their payload skimming across the water before erupting against hulls. The P-38 screamed overhead, their twin engines ripping the air apart as they tore through Japanese Zero escorts. Within 20 minutes, the battle turned catastrophic. Transport after transport erupted into fireballs. Men threw themselves into burning seas. The Lightnings, flying cover, dove through the chaos to cut down survivors attempting to reach life rafts. It was not cruelty, it was strategy. Japan could not afford to lose ships and men. By the end of the second day, all 8 transports and 4 destroyers lay beneath the waves. Only about 200 men, of nearly 7,000, ever made it back to land. The rest vanished into the Bismarck Sea, swallowed by flame and salt water. The Japanese Navy tried to suppress the truth. Official reports spoke of heavy losses but successful reinforcement. In private, however, the despair was absolute. Intercepted communications later revealed a senior Japanese staff officer admitting, "The enemy air superiority is complete. Our forces move only to die. For the Americans, the victory was more than tactical, it was psychological. The P-38 had proven itself not just as a fighter, but as a weapon of dominance. Its long range made ambushes possible. Its speed turned retreat into slaughter. But in Tokyo, few truly understood what had just happened. To them, the Lightning was still an anomaly, a brute force machine that could be countered through discipline and sacrifice. They still believed Japan's spirit could overcome America's industry. They were wrong. The tide had already turned, and the ripples of the Bismarck Sea would soon reach the highest ranks of Japan's navy. All the way to Admiral Yamamoto himself, Rabaul, April 1943. The great fortress of Japan's Pacific Empire lay hidden beneath clouds and jungle mist. Its airfields thundered day and night, the heart of Imperial Command for the South Pacific. But inside Yamamoto's command bunker, the atmosphere had shifted. What once echoed with certainty now vibrated with unease. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, sat surrounded by maps, dispatches, and casualty reports. The news from the Bismarck Sea was worse than anyone dared tell him aloud. Nearly an entire convoy lost, thousands of men gone, and American fighters now striking with precision deep into territory once thought untouchable. Yamamoto's hand trembled as he folded the latest situation report. The Americans, he muttered, learn faster than we expected. He was not blind. He had studied at Harvard, traveled the United States, seen its factories and shipyards firsthand. Before the war, he had warned Tokyo that fighting America meant suicide. He once said, "If I am told to fight, I will run wild for 6 months. But beyond that, I cannot guarantee victory." Now, it had been 16 months since Pearl Harbor, and his prophecy was coming true. To lift morale among his exhausted pilots and soldiers, Yamamoto planned a bold gesture, a personal inspection tour across frontline bases in the Solomons. The trip was meant to inspire, but to his staff it felt reckless. The skies were no longer Japan's domain. American P-38s prowled the edges of every route. Still, Yamamoto insisted. "The men must see that I have not lost faith," he said. It was a decision made not from arrogance, but from duty. He had built the sword that struck at Pearl Harbor. Now, as it dulled, he would face the soldiers who still fought with its edge. On April 14, 1943, Tokyo transmitted his itinerary in a coded message. Times, routes, escort numbers, believing it unbreakable. But American codebreakers at Station Hypo intercepted it. Within hours, every detail of Yamamoto's flight was known. To U.S. commanders, it was an opportunity so extraordinary it bordered on impossible. Admiral William Halsey's message went out to the 339th Fighter Squadron. "Get Yamamoto." In a dimly lit tent on Guadalcanal, Major John Mitchell of the 339th unfolded a map. The mission that would change history had just been born. Guadalcanal, April 17, 1943. The briefing tent was silent except for the drone of distant engines. Major John Mitchell stood before a small group of pilots, hand-picked men from the 339th Fighter Squadron, each hardened by months of brutal combat in the Solomon skies. Before them lay a rough map of Bougainville and Rabaul, drawn in pencil and sweat. Mitchell pointed to a red line sweeping across the ocean. "This," he said quietly, "is Yamamoto's flight path. He'll be flying from Rabaul to Balale. He's scheduled to arrive at 9:45 a.m., and we'll be waiting." The pilots glanced at each other. The name hung in the air like electricity. Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had set the Pacific ablaze. Intelligence left no doubt. The intercepted Japanese message was authentic, coded using their most secure cipher, yet cracked by American cryptanalysts at Station Hypo and Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne. It listed exact times, altitudes, and escort details. 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. The plan, codenamed Operation Vengeance, demanded perfection. The target would be deep inside enemy territory, nearly 1,000 miles round trip, pushing the absolute limit of the P-38's range. Any mistake in navigation, fuel management, or timing would mean death. To make it possible, each Lightning would carry long-range drop tanks. The pilots would fly at wave-top level, no more than 50 feet above the sea, invisible to radar. Radio silence was absolute. If one engine failed, no one would turn back. Mitchell studied the route again. Every minute was calculated. If Yamamoto's aircraft stayed on schedule, they would intercept him at exactly 9:34 a.m. over Bougainville's southern coast. The Americans would climb from the sea like ghosts, strike once and then disappear. Before the meeting ended, one pilot broke the silence. "Major, how sure are we it's really him?" Mitchell paused. "Intel says it's him. He's always punctual. To the minute." No one laughed. Every man understood what this meant. This was not just another mission. This was justice. That night, the airstrip at Guadalcanal was quiet. The P-38s gleamed under the moonlight, their fuselages marked and armed. The pilots lay in their bunks, unable to sleep, their minds tracing every mile of the route. Before dawn, Mitchell gave the final order. "We're going to cut the head off the snake." And as the first engines roared to life, the jungle trembled, unaware that by the next sunrise, the most powerful admiral in Japan would be dead. Dawn bled into a thin gray over the ocean as 16 P-38s crawled from darkness into motion. Engines coughed, warmed, then steadied into the twin-throated rhythm of Allison power plants. The fighters taxied to the strip with the mechanical discipline of a funeral procession, every pilot rehearsing the same cold arithmetic: fuel consumption, wind drift, compass headings, clock. Navigation would be the mission's heartbeat, a single misread mark, a half-mile error 1 minute off schedule, and the entire plan would dissolve into the Pacific. They lifted at 0710, climbing not into ceremony but into the work of survival. 2 aircraft faltered with mechanical gremlins and were grounded. The remainder peeled into formation, riding low above the water to hide their silhouette and to conserve what little fuel their tanks allowed. For 2 hours and 20 minutes, they skimmed the waves at 50 feet, a procession of silver ghosts tracing a route of compass bearings and dead reckoning, instruments whispering numbers, pilots counting time like prayer beads. Radio silence boxed their breaths. Each man carried the knowledge that there would be no second chance. The sky remained deceptive, a pale, placid blanket concealing the hazard beneath. Navigation demanded perfection. Mitchell had plotted a long, curved approach to avoid enemy-held islands and coast-watcher posts, a route that forced the fighters to thread the needle of distance and discretion. The drop tanks, heavy with the fuel that made the range possible, slowed their climb but extended their reach. The lightnings were burdened and lethal in the same moment. At 09:34, as planned, the lookout cried out. On the horizon, a small formation moved with the deliberate grace of a military clock. 2 G4M Betty medium bombers in trail, 6 Zeros weaving above like guardians. Mitchell's hands were steady as he issued orders. The 4 best pilots peel off to form the killer flight. The rest climb to provide top cover, belly tanks jettisoned in a metallic hiss. The formation folded into attack positions with the mechanical choreography of combat-trained killers. They climbed fast, then faster, trading the ocean's cool surface for the thin, glassy air above. The lightnings dove through the escort, slashing with a concentrated cone of nose guns that transformed a burst into surgical violence. The first bomber's right engine detonated under the concentrated .50 caliber hammer. Wings sheared. The fuselage broke like a struck mast, and the lead Betty pitched into the green canopy of Bougainville. The second bomber coned down into the sea after sustaining critical damage. 1 P-38 did not return. Lieutenant Raymond Hine was last seen trailing a Zero toward the open ocean. Claims of credit would become tangled afterward. Each pilot filed his report, and war would stitch together competing testimonies. Post-war records and crash site examinations increasingly favored the account that Lieutenant Rex Barber's fire struck true against the Admiral's aircraft, though the fog of combat would never yield a single indisputable image. What was indisputable was the precision. The interception occurred within minutes of the predicted time, executed in a matter of moments, and yielded a result that echoed beyond the wreckage. April 18, 1943, Rabaul. The Japanese naval headquarters erupted in disbelief. Reports from returning Zeros were fragmented, confused, almost impossible to reconcile. The lead bomber, carrying Admiral Yamamoto, had vanished into the jungle canopy of Bougainville. The second bomber, carrying Vice Admiral Ugaki, had crashed into the sea. Only 1 P-38 had been lost. At first, disbelief clung to the commanders like smoke. "The Admiral cannot be dead," one officer insisted. Yamamoto was more than a strategist. He was the embodiment of Japan's naval doctrine, the symbol of invincibility that had guided the empire's expansion across the Pacific. His death was inconceivable. The wreckage was found the following day. Yamamoto's body had been thrown clear of the fuselage, killed instantly by concentrated .50 caliber fire. His ceremonial sword remained in his grasp, a final testament to discipline, courage, and ritual even in death. But the precision of the American attack shattered more than just his life. It shattered the very confidence of the Imperial Navy. Captain Watanabe, assigned to recover the wreckage, later recorded, "The Admiral maintained dignity even in death." The precision of the attack, appearing at the exact moment in the exact place, destroyed our faith in invulnerability. Across the islands, the psychological impact was immediate. Pilots who had once trusted in the legend of Japanese supremacy now realized they were prey. The P-38 was not merely a fighter. It was an instrument of inevitability, a weapon capable of projecting American industrial and tactical power across hundreds of miles. Within weeks, intelligence assessments were rewritten. The P-38 was no longer clumsy or inferior. Maximum speed exceeded 400 miles per hour. Service ceiling surpassed 40,000 feet. Combat range exceeded 1,000 miles with auxiliary tanks. Armament was concentrated, devastating, precise. Climb rate outperformed every Japanese fighter at altitudes above 15,000 feet. Tactical doctrine shifted overnight. Japanese pilots were instructed never to follow the P-38 into high-speed dives, never to attempt climbing engagements above 20,000 feet, and only to strike when the Lightning was committed to ground or bomber attack. Every principle of aerial combat that had dominated the Pacific since 1937 had been reversed in a matter of minutes. The P-38 had accomplished what no single dogfight, no naval engagement had done. It had dismantled the Japanese philosophy of aerial warfare. The lessons were brutal. The warrior spirit alone was insufficient. Precision, speed, and planning now dictated the skies. In a single mission, American aviation had rewritten the rules of war, and the laughter that once greeted the twin-tailed Lightning in Guadalcanal had died forever. By mid-1943, the P-38 had begun a relentless campaign that would systematically dismantle Japanese air power across the Solomons and New Guinea. The losses were catastrophic, particularly among the elite cadre of pre-war trained pilots. These men, once considered untouchable, now found themselves outpaced, outgunned, and outmaneuvered by an aircraft designed not for grace, but for dominance. The statistics were damning. Japanese pilots averaged just 200 flight hours before entering combat, while P-38 pilots had 400 or more. Survival rates told the story of technological inevitability. After 10 missions, 60% of Japanese pilots would be dead or incapacitated, compared to 20% for Americans. The attrition of skill, experience, and morale was staggering. Entire squadrons were hollowed out, replaced by rushed trainees with mere hours on type, sent into combat like lambs to a blade. The P-38's versatility amplified the crisis. It could escort bombers across ranges the Zero could not reach, maintain altitude advantages that made intercept impossible, and strike targets deep within Japanese defensive networks with precision. Japanese fighters, once the masters of the Pacific, were forced to defend against an enemy that existed everywhere at once, maintaining energy superiority and dictating every engagement. The industrial reality compounded the problem. Japan struggled to produce even 300-400 aircraft per month, with material shortages and declining quality. Meanwhile, Lockheed churned out the P-38 at over 400 per month at peak production, alongside P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, and F-6F Hellcats. Each American aircraft arrived refined by combat experience, incorporating lessons learned from every sortie, while Japanese designs stagnated, increasingly obsolete before they could even be deployed. The P-38 also reshaped the very strategy of warfare. Its long range allowed bomber raids that had previously been impossible, protected by escort that could fly hundreds of miles beyond enemy reach. B-24 Liberators struck at key supply points with near impunity, their wings shadowed by lightnings that made interception futile. The concept of safe Japanese airspace, once absolute, was now a relic of the past. Surviving Japanese pilots interrogated after the war admitted the psychological devastation. The P-38 was everywhere, elusive and merciless. We were no longer fighting pilots, Lieutenant Commander Sadamu Kamachi recalled. We were fighting a system, speed, firepower, and planning combined into one relentless machine. By late 1943, the destruction was nearly total. Japan's best pilots were dead, its veteran squadrons shattered, and the skies they once dominated belonged to a machine the Imperial Navy had once mocked. The laughter had ended, replaced by fear and fatalism. By late 1943, the P-38 had evolved beyond a mere fighter into a strategic instrument of American air power. Its role in long-range bomber escort transformed the Pacific theater. Previously, B-24 Liberators and B-17s had been vulnerable to interception, confined to the reach of Japanese fighters. Now, with P-38s shadowing them for over 1,000 miles, bombing missions penetrated deep into enemy territory with near impunity. The P-38's range allowed the Americans to strike at previously untouchable positions, airfields, supply depots, naval bases, while maintaining fighter protection. Japanese pilots attempting to intercept these formations faced an almost impossible challenge. Any climb to meet the enemy meant sacrificing energy advantage, speed, and survival. Those who attempted the interception often became casualties before they could reach the bombers. Technical improvements continually widened the gap. Pilots adopted Charles Lindbergh's techniques for optimal cruise and fuel management, extending operational range by up to 30%. The P-38 could now perform multiple roles in a single mission: fighter, bomber escort, reconnaissance, and precision strike aircraft. Its concentrated nose armament, combined with superior climb and dive performance, rendered the once feared Zero increasingly irrelevant. The strategic consequences were devastating. Japanese planning documents from 1944 reveal the extent of their constraints. Fleet movements had to account for the Lightning's reach. Daylight operations within its radius were near suicidal. Entire campaigns were delayed or canceled. The P-38's presence forced Japan to fight only on unfavorable terms, a relentless inversion of strategic initiative. Casualty reports reflected this transformation. Japanese pilots, many of whom had trained for years, were now being outclassed by the combination of superior equipment and tactical discipline. Replacement pilots, hastily trained and ill-prepared, faced near-certain death. American pilots, conversely, benefited from rigorous training programs, extensive flight hours, and mentorship from combat veterans. By mid-1944, the P-38 had become synonymous with inevitability. It was present wherever Japanese forces faced American air power, often unseen until the attack was underway. The combination of endurance, firepower, and tactical planning created an unbreakable advantage, a system the Japanese could neither match nor outwit. The age of individual aerial heroism, where skill alone could decide battles, was ending. The P-38 demonstrated that in modern warfare, planning, range, technology, and industrial capacity dictated outcomes. It was no longer a duel of warriors, but a war of machines and systems. A paradigm the Japanese Navy had been forced to confront with fatal consequences. By 1944, the Pacific skies were no longer a battlefield of parity. Japanese naval aviation, once the world's elite, had been reduced to shadows of its former self. Veteran pilots were gone, training programs truncated, and aircraft obsolescent. In contrast, the P-38 Lightning, alongside F-6F Hellcats, P-51 Mustangs, and F-4U Corsairs, dominated every engagement, embodying the union of American industrial capacity, tactical innovation, and relentless training. The P-38's versatility continued to define operations. It served as fighter, reconnaissance plane, and precision bomber escort, simultaneously gathering intelligence and enforcing air superiority. Wherever Japanese forces moved, Lightnings followed, often invisible until it was too late. Enemy formations attempting to climb or engage were met with concentrated firepower from above, while escape routes were cut by superior speed and altitude advantage. Even the most advanced Japanese designs, the N-1K2J Shidenkai George and the Ki-84 Hayat Franken, could not reverse the tide. They arrived too late in too few numbers to influence the war's momentum. The P-38 had already rewritten the rules of aerial engagement. The combination of concentrated firepower, long-range endurance, And energy retention made traditional dogfighting tactics obsolete. The loss of institutional knowledge was equally catastrophic. Each engagement not only destroyed aircraft but also erased generations of experience. Japanese commanders now faced a grim reality. Their strategies were conceived for a world that no longer existed. The P-38 had destroyed more than planes. It had destroyed doctrine. In 1945, even as the war approached Japan's home islands, the Lightnings remained omnipresent. Their missions over Okinawa, the Philippines, and the Marianas illustrated the new calculus of warfare. Airfields that had once been untouchable were vulnerable. Fleet movements had to account for strikes hundreds of miles away, and Japanese pilots flew knowing that any miscalculation meant immediate death. Post-war interviews revealed a stark truth among surviving Japanese pilots. Lieutenant Commander Sadamu Kamachi and Captain Teo Tanamiu recalled that the P-38 was not the fastest, not the most maneuverable, but it was everywhere, good enough at everything, and fundamentally unrelenting. The aircraft's presence forced Japanese airmen to abandon centuries-old philosophies of spirit and honor in favor of a cold, mechanized arithmetic of survival, one they could not master. The psychological and strategic consequences were irreversible. By the final months of the war, Japanese naval aviation had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. The P-38 had not merely fought battles, it had dismantled an entire empire's concept of air warfare. By 1945, the Pacific skies were ruled not by skill alone, but by systems, production, and strategy. The P-38 Lightning, once dismissed as cumbersome and excessive, had become the embodiment of American industrial and tactical supremacy. From Guadalcanal to the Japanese home islands, it was everywhere. A silent arbiter of inevitability, Admiral Yamamoto's death on April 18, 1943, marked more than the loss of a brilliant strategist. It was a demonstration of the new rules of warfare. Intelligence, timing, and long-range capability could strike with surgical precision across hundreds of miles. 16 P-38s flying over 400 miles from Guadalcanal intercepted Yamamoto's plane to the exact minute, executed their attack in less than 10 minutes, and returned with minimal losses. This was not luck. It was planning, discipline, and technology functioning flawlessly. Post-war Japanese assessments revealed a harsh truth. Every assumption about American design and capability had been wrong. The P-38 represented redundancy over simplicity, energy over maneuver, concentrated firepower over elegance, multi-role versatility over specialization, and pilot protection over weight reduction. Every quality once mocked as excess proved decisive. Japan had built the ultimate sword. America had built the machine that rendered swords irrelevant. The P-38 did more than destroy aircraft. It dismantled doctrine, shattered morale, and redefined aerial combat. Veteran pilots were gone. Inexperienced replacements were outclassed, and the skies they had once dominated were no longer their own. Industrial mathematics, methodical planning, and systematic training proved more lethal than courage alone. The legacy extended beyond the battlefield. It was a lesson in modern warfare. No warrior, no matter how skilled or courageous, could withstand the combination of technological innovation, production capacity, and operational discipline. The P-38 demonstrated that wars were won by systems, not swords, by industrial strategy, not bravery, by coordinated design, not individual heroics. By April 1943, the laughter at Guadalcanal had ended. By 1944, the P-38 ruled the Pacific. By 1945, Japanese naval aviation had ceased to exist as a coherent force. The age of the samurai was over. The age of industrial warfare had arrived. The twin-engine shadows of the Lightning had struck not just at planes, but at the very philosophy of war, leaving an irreversible mark on history. The P-38 had killed Yamamoto. It had killed the myths of invincibility. It had rewritten the rules of aerial combat forever. And in its wake, the only sound that remained was the relentless drone of Allison engines, carrying American power wherever it chose, whenever it chose. The American century had begun, and the lesson of the Lightning echoed across the Pacific until the rising sun finally set on August 15, 1945.